Brace yourself for the threat of more tariffs. The Trump administration is expanding its so-called trade investigation to include more countries, including Canada.
Well, we know Donald Trump is absolutely committed, Cynthia, to keeping tariffs in place, even though the U.S. Supreme Court last month knocked down the so-called fentanyl tariffs he imposed on Canada and Mexico shortly after taking office. It also basically voided all the Liberation Day tariffs. So Trump now needs to find other mechanisms in U.S. law to justify new tariffs. That's why the U.S. is launching investigations under something called Section 301 of the American Trade Act, and that allows the U.S. to sanction the trade practices of foreign nations it considers to be harmful, including the use of forced labor, essentially slavery.
The United States government has just opened a forced labor trade investigation that includes Canada. Let that sink in. Washington, a state whose own constitutional order still permits involuntary servitude as punishment for crime, has now put Canada on a Section 301 list over alleged failures to ban goods made with forced labor. And this did not happen in some quiet technical corner of trade law. It happened just weeks after the U.S. Supreme Court blew a hole in Trump's global tariff strategy. That timing is not a coincidence. That timing is the story. On March 12, the U.S. Trade Representative launched a new Section 301 investigation into 60 economies. Canada is on the list. So are the EU, Britain, Australia, Israel, India, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. The official claim is that these governments may have failed to impose and effectively enforce bans on goods produced with forced labor. But Reuters also reported that the Trump administration was already trying to rebuild tariff pressure after the Supreme Court struck down its sweeping global tariffs on February 20th. So let's stop pretending this came out of nowhere. This is not just a labor rights story. It is a post-defeat trade pressures story. Now, here is where this gets morally outrageous and strategically revealing at the same time. Canada is not spotless on labor. That has to be said honestly. Amnesty International said in January 2025 that abuse in Canada's temporary foreign worker program is systemic. A UN Special Rapporteur also concluded that the program remains a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery. Those are serious warnings. They deserve serious reform. But that is exactly why Washington's move is so revealing. If this were really about labor justice, the United States would be talking about evidence, benchmarks, enforcement cooperation, supply chain transparency, shared reform. Instead, it reached immediately for a Section 301 club. It swept up 60 economies at once. From China and Russia to Canada, and the European Union. And it did so just as Trump was scrambling to recover trade leverage before the next phase of tariff politics. That is not how a government behaves when labor rights are the true priority. That is how a government behaves when it wants a morally saleable excuse for renewed pressure. And the hypocrisy is impossible to ignore. Canada has had an import ban on goods produced with forced labor since July 2020. It brought that in as part of its CUSMA commitments. It also brought the Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Act into force on January 1, 2024. That law requires annual reporting by government institutions and covered entities. In other words, Canada does have a forced labor legal framework. Critics may say enforcement is too weak. That is a legitimate debate. But this is not a country with no rules. This is a country with rules that Washington now says are insufficient. And Washington is saying that at the exact moment it needs new instruments of coercion. Then there is the American contradiction staring everyone in the face. The same constitutional order now posturing as a global labor policeman still carries the 13th Amendment exception allowing involuntary servitude as punishment for crime. That does not mean every prison work program is identical to a forced labor import case. But it does mean Washington is walking into this fight carrying a giant moral blind spot. And when a government with that blind spot starts using labor rights rhetoric as a trade weapon against allies, people are right to ask what this is really about. Justice or leverage? Now, let's build the timeline. Because the timeline is what exposes intent. First came the tariff war. In March 2025, after Trump imposed new steel and aluminium tariffs, Canada hit back with $29.8 billion Canadian dollars in retaliatory tariffs. Then, Ottawa launched a WTO dispute over the US duties. That was already the clearest sign that Canada had stopped treating Trump's trade threats as noise. Canada was willing to counterpunch. Then came Trump's own devaluation of the agreement. In January 2026, Trump said the United States does not need CUSMA. He called it effectively irrelevant to the US. That matters. Because it signaled that the White House was entering the 2026 CUSMA review not as a steward of continental stability, but as a disruptive force already questioning the value of the deal itself. Then came the legal setback. On February 20th, the Supreme Court struck down Trump's global tariffs under the emergency authority he had used. Reuters reported that the administration immediately began looking for ways to rebuild tariff pressure through other legal channels. Then, less than 3 weeks later, USTR rolled out the forced labor probes. That sequence matters. Because it tells you this was not some isolated burst of moral conscience. It was part of a strategic search for new pressure points after the old ones were cut down in court. Then came the diplomatic confession. On March 12, Reuters reported that US Ambassador Pete Hoekstra said Washington was facing headwinds in trade negotiations with Canada. He also said there had been no substantive discussions since October. And he said this with the July 1, 2026 mandatory review date getting close. That is a stunning admission. Because when your own ambassador is publicly acknowledging stalled talks, you are no longer in the realm of quiet friction. You are in the realm of strategic fracture. And this is where the Canadian response becomes a moment of dignity. Mark Carney has not responded like a man begging for calm at any price. He has responded like a leader telling his country to stop pretending the old relationship is normal. In January, he said almost nothing is normal now in the United States. He also told countries in Davos to accept that the rules-based order once championed by Washington was ending. And Reuters reported that he is pushing Canada toward a more diversified global trading posture less reliant on the United States. That matters because this is not just pushback. It is a reorientation. Carney is not saying Canada will never talk to Washington again. Canada still sees value in private government conversations, sectoral discussions, and the broader review process. But the posture has changed. Canada is no longer behaving as though dependence on the American market is a permanent fact of nature. It is increasingly treating that dependence as a strategic vulnerability. Now bring this down to earth. This is not just about legal notices and diplomatic mood. It is about real workers in real sectors whose livelihoods depend on trust across the border. Canada supplies about 60% of US primary aluminium demand. Roughly $18 billion in steel goods are traded annually between the two countries. Canada exported $7.6 billion in softwood lumber to the United States in 2024. And more than $4 billion worth of goods cross US borders with Canada and Mexico every day. These are not abstract numbers. These are smelter jobs, forestry towns, assembly lines, rail corridors, ports, trucking contracts, farmers, warehouses, communities. And do not make the mistake of thinking the damage stops at the Canadian side of the border. American farmers shipped nearly $28 billion in agricultural products to Canada last year. Continental manufacturing remains deeply integrated, especially in autos. Parts cross borders repeatedly. Costs stack fast. Delays ripple fast. And uncertainty alone can shift investment decisions, reorder supply chains, and make firms pay more just to insure against Washington's unpredictability. So let's zoom out. This is not only a Canada story. And it is not only a Labour story. It is a story about order, sovereignty, rules, and trust. If the United States can use human rights language as a unilateral pressure tool against Canada, a country that already has a forced labor import ban and a supply chain reporting law, then every ally is being taught the same lesson. The issue is no longer whether you are aligned with Washington. The issue is whether Washington finds it useful, in that moment, to weaponize morality against you. And that has consequences far beyond one investigation. It corrodes the value of CUSMA just as the review clock is ticking. It tells allies that legal frameworks can be treated as optional. It encourages diversification away from the US market. And it deepens the strategic fracture we have already been discussing for months. A Canada that still needs the United States, but trusts it less, and plans more seriously for a future in which it cannot rely on Washington the way it once did. And that leads to the bigger political choice. There are two roads from here. One road says this: if labor rights are serious, then build a real North American enforcement framework. Clean up Canadian vulnerabilities. Clean up American hypocrisy. And strengthen the rules through evidence and cooperation. The other road says this: use labor rights as a branding exercise for renewed tariffs. Destabilize trust before the July review. And turn CUSMA into one more arena where power matters more than process. That is the real choice now. Not just for Trump. Not just for Carney. But for the future of North American integration itself. Because if Washington keeps treating its closest ally like a convenient target whenever domestic politics demand a villain, then this will not end with one probe. It will end with something much larger. Allies deciding that the cost of dependence on the United States is becoming harder to justify than the pain of diversifying away from it. And once logic takes hold, you do not just lose a trade argument. You lose a generation of trust.